there's not a handout in the, we'll produce a handout for you. We ordered the, I mentioned to you last time that we ordered some iPads and we encounter a little bit of a challenge trying to download and get them ready. So that probably you'll see a card be brought in at some time, and I see some of you brought some devices, so we'll have those available hopefully later on this morning. In June, we have, like I said, the IRS, and we have probably a couple other folks coming in. I think I talked to our auditors to do how to prepare a Form 990. We have a nonprofit organization or you're a charter on how to prepare a Form 990 for your organization. So welcome. So we'll have probably a couple of breaks in between and lunch sometime around 11ish. We don't get hungry. If it gets here earlier, we'll try to break out as soon as we can. So I'm going to turn it over now to David, give you a little bit of an update on Gulf Coast Tasco and golf, and then we'll get started with the first percent.
Two things real quick before we get started. How many of you will admit, besides me, to watching Dr. Phil occasionally? I feel so much better about myself after I watch Dr. Phil because his guests are idiots. So I watch Dr. Phil. But one of the things that they've been hawking on Dr. Phil lately is that doctor on demand thing. You know, if you watch Dr. Phil, you got to know what I'm talking about because they bring it up almost every show. I record them all. Interesting concept, and what our last speaker is going to talk about during or right after lunch is something very similar. So if you're inclined to stick around for most of the day, don't skip out on the end just because maybe you came to talk about bonds or learn about bonds, and that's not a bond-related topic. This is cutting-edge stuff. It's semi-revolutionary in nature. And if you've seen the Doctor on Demand app or the way they hawked it on Dr. Phil, you'll know about where that discussion is going to go. Very, very interesting. Bob Tracy is a very smart, very experienced consultant. He'll be here to talk about that. Second thing, golf tournament. We do our golf tournament, Gulf Coast Tasbo, every year this time. It is always the last Friday in April. You can just mark that on your calendar with no end. And we are the largest contributor to the Tasbo Scholarship Fund each and every year now. This year, maybe not quite so much. About every third year or so, we have an off year. This year is that off year. We will probably only contribute about $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 to the scholarship fund. That's my idea of an off year. I had a goal of $25,000 for this year. Not going to get there, and I'm not worried about it. We'll get there next year. Every time we have an off year, the next year is a big year. So next year, our goal will be what this year's goal was, which is $25,000. I've got a lot of teams, so it's going to look very impressive. If you come out to the golf course, John will probably be there. Pete, who else is going to be there? Chris? You will see a lot of golfers and a lot of carts, and it will be very impressive. It's just financially not going to net as much as we wanted to, but like I said, we'll make up for that next year. All right, I have spoken on this topic several times. I look like my suit's coming around. Well done. And this is the last time I'm going to present this slideshow. I'm going to retire it after today for two reasons. One, it's run its course, had its day, and I'm tired of it. But there's some good information in here. I think most importantly, what we're going to hear from the ratings people later may update and change some of this. So I'm very interested to hurry up and say what I'm going to say and then sit down and hear what they're going to say and see how much of this still holds true. 5 years ago, 2009, at this meeting, I'm sitting here thinking, I want to hear what the rating agency people have to say, because up till 2009, I still thought of the ratings process as somewhat mysterious, a little hard to get a handle on as far as what they were looking at, what were they emphasizing. And I'm sitting there scribbling my notes and just paying attention halfway, and I heard something, and then I heard something else, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the Holy Grail. These rating agency people are up here in a panel, and they are actually, for the first time that I can remember, they are just telling us what their priorities are, what they're looking at, where their emphasis comes from when they're rating our bonds. I better wake up, pay more attention, and start taking notes. So I took some notes, I made some phone calls afterward to clarify some issues, and here's what I came up with. A little preamble. Obviously, your ratings are very important. Most of us, if not all of us, will have the PSF guarantee. And I don't know that there's a school district in Texas that has ever defaulted on their bonds. So with PSF, with no default in our history ever, we're a pretty safe bet. Texas school district bonds sell out there in the bond market like hotcakes. There are, trust me, we're working on the other side now for the last year. I can tell you there are some stressed, challenged issuers out there that are hard to sell. Texas bonds, we don't have to sell them. We just have to put them out there and they fly off the shelf. But your ratings are still important because it does, relative to other districts, communicate your potential credit worthiness. It will determine, in some measure, the cost of borrowing. And from our standpoint as CFOs, as business managers, that they do reflect to a certain degree on our management practices. And if you look at how they're rated, how the school districts in Texas are rating, it's not exactly a bell curve, but with a few little bumps and lumps and a shift toward the higher end of the spectrum, for the most part, we've got good ratings in Texas. Anyone got AAA on their underlying? There's how many? 7. Moody's has 7, S&P has 2. That may have changed in the last couple of months. Been 2 or 3 months since I updated this. So that's not very many. I think there are a handful of school districts, 20 to 30, that probably merit serious consideration for AAA. And one of the things I'm interested in hearing from the ratings folks today is where we might be going in the future. One of the things I heard 5 years ago today was the 4 areas that they focus on: current and future debt plans, financial performance, economic conditions, and obviously financial management. They obviously want to know what projects are planned, how much money we have apportioned for each. They're going to look at our debt structure and see how our new debt will fit in to our existing debt structure. And they consider overlapping debt, which you and I have no control over. Other issuers, other taxing entities that you overlap with, and how much debt they have out there. Obviously, financial performance is important. And one thing I have read several times, and you know this well, we do not have a lot of flexibility. We do have more than adequate, well, I won't say more than adequate reserves, but we have more in our general fund balances than most school districts in other states. your local economy, how that impacts you. In Deer Park, I had one big I had several big taxpayers, but I had one that dwarfed all the others. And that's good, because that one big shell plant and refinery provided a lot of value, and they don't have a vote. It's not like that $1.2 billion of Shell can come and elect a trustee or vote no on a bond election. They just pay the taxes when we levy them. Having all your eggs in one basket, not always a good thing from a rating agency perspective. Sometimes they look at that as over-reliance on one industry or one major taxpayer. What I always told them is, look, I can have a downturn in the economy, and a lot of these people who live in the homes can pack up and move away. Shell plant and refinery not going to pack up and move away. I'm happy that that's my #1 taxpayer. I'm happy that they're a huge piece of my tax base, because they can't go anywhere in the world and rebuild that plant for less than 3 times what it's valued for right now. And of course, financial management, they're going to look at what we do, how we manage our finances, how we document all that. And they will look at, they have looked at in recent years, our investment practices as well. The 10 things that I noted in our discussion here 5 years ago, there may have been more than 10. I caught 10. And the first one is adequate reserves. A key theme you will see through the next few slides is not only the topic up at the top in red, but somewhere in there a bullet point or highlighted, a bold type about having these things in writing. It is fine and dandy to have adequate reserves. Lots of good things about it. I had a trustee ask me, how much is enough? And we had a discussion about that. And he said, how much is too much? And I told him, that's a whole different discussion. There is no such thing as too much. What is enough? We can play formula math with that all day long, but too much, there's no such thing as too much. If you have a written plan, you have a board policy, you have something in your budget document that says it is the board's stated goal for this year to maintain reserves at X level, however you figure that out. 25% of operating expenses, 3 months operating expenses, whatever that number is. If you have that in writing, I think they appreciate that more than if you just say, well, it's our goal to maintain 25%, and we've always had that goal, but you don't have it written down anywhere. Multi-year financial forecasting. I have, at different points in my career, some of you have done this also, where you have taken your current year or your last year with the audit report, you look at this year's budget and how you're trending, and you've done something, formal or otherwise, detailed or summary, to kind of project that out. Where am I right now? Where am I headed? Where is that going to take me in 5 years? And it might just be something you pencil out on the tablet. It might be something you do on a spreadsheet or put together real formally to show the board. I have at different points in my career shown that to the board to say, if nothing significant changes, here's where we're going to be in 5 years. And then you can look at that point and say, that's a good place to be, or it's not so good. And if it's not so good, it's easier to make those course corrections now than wait until you're almost there and then have to do something drastic. Financial reporting, interim financial reporting, aside from the comprehensive annual financial report or the TEA financial and compliance report, I think they appreciate the fact that we do interim reporting of some type. I have always put together a financial statement that not as lengthy as the TEA financial and compliance report certainly, but formatted to look a lot like that. each month for my board. And the reason I did it that way is so when we looked at the TEA report at the end of the year, it didn't look foreign and alien to them. It was a format that they were familiar with. I learned the hard way that it eliminated a lot of questions in December or January when you were approving your audit. Contingency plans. Everyone has got contingency plans. Down here, what do we do if a hurricane comes and power is out, facilities are damaged? Up in Dallas, they worry a little bit more about hailstorms and tornadoes than they do about hurricanes. What contingency plans do you have from a facility standpoint, from a financial standpoint? If you get hit with a hurricane 2 weeks before payroll has to go out, what are you going to do to get payroll? What are you going to do to manage your investments? What are you going to do? What is your continuity plan? You've all got them. Does anyone not have a continuity plan? If a hurricane hits, you're just thinking, that's it, I'm out. Getting out of here, going to Dallas, take my chances with hailstorms. You've all got how many of you have a contingency plan documented in an emergency preparedness manual somewhere? Thank you, thank you. They love that. Because they know you have a plan. You know you have a plan. But you don't really have a plan until you have one right. Then you have proof that you have a plan. And you can show it to them at a rate. Yes, sir?
It's just in my mind.
It's just in your mind. Yes, now I'm on the dark side. My contingency plan is I'm getting out of here 3 days ahead of time. Non-recurring revenue. There are, I'm sure y'all can think of a number of different things that constitute non-recurring revenue. We have auctions. We auction off surplus equipment. What else? What falls into that 7,900 other resources category? Lots of different things. Most of the time that doesn't add up to 15% of our revenue and other operating resources for the year. But if you've got a plan for how you're going to deal with those, a written plan for how those funds will be spent, then look upon that favorably. Has anyone ever had 15% of your revenues and other resources come from that miscellaneous, non-recurring? Debt management, three-part topic here. Affordability. I think we all have a debt management policy now. TASB's got the standard debt policy, and many of y'all, we may hear about that later today, have elaborated on that to a certain extent. Obviously, affordability is important. Post-issuance disclosure practices are very important, much more important than they were. Well, they've always been important. We've been a little more aware of them in the last few years. For most of you, your financial advisor probably takes care of that. You may have some information to submit to them, but they take care of it. Does anyone do that themselves? Okay. And debt avoidance. If you can pay for small projects as you go, they look on that favorably, and they should. I talked to a little school district yesterday that is going to sell some bonds to do some different projects, but one of the projects they want to do was not part of the bond election, and they want to borrow some money to do that project, but they want to borrow it out of their general fund. So we spent yesterday talking about the different options they have to do that. They'll probably pay half of it out of their general fund and then finance the other half out of the general fund with a maintenance tax note or contractual obligation or something like that, and keep it out of the bond. They won't have to go back and ask for another election for this small project. They will pay it off in a very short period of time, about 3 years. And The agencies, I believe, will tell us later that they look upon that favorably. Rapid debt retirement. I've changed this number several times because I keep hearing different things from different people in my industry, 60, 65%. If you can compress your debt service schedule so that 60 to 65% of your bonds will be retired in the first 10 years, then obviously you're lowering your interest costs over the estimated life of the bonds. And that's good. If you could pay your house off in 15 years instead of 30, you would. If you could buy a car and pay it off in 2 or 3 years instead of 4 or 5 years, you would do that, wouldn't you? Get it paid off sooner, cost you less in the long run.
Yeah, let me make a comment on this. There's in the first report and the first rating, there's a debt indicator. It says the TA says you can't have more than X amount per student, and if there's different levels, and if you don't meet it, then you either don't meet the rating or you get less points on that. Recently, I was talking to a district that didn't meet that rating, and so as a result of the points, they failed. And so when asking TA on the response, well, what can I do? You know, I mean, in some situations you're growing, in other situations you're losing students, so your debt is constant for 20, 25 years, and if your students are going down, well, the ratio is going to be affected. But there's really very little you can do, and I was really surprised at the response. And the response was, here's a hearing on the solvency plan. And so those of you that have seen the solvency plan, if you have to do a solvency plan, it's because you don't have enough money, you don't have enough reserves, and you have a problem. Yet the response was, well, lower your debt.
Oh, sure.
Well,
let me just refund all my bonds and restructure.
And pay and structure.
Regardless of what the interest rate market may be.
I was just mind-boggling to hear that the alternative is I didn't meet that indicator yet. I'm supposed to lower my debt at a time that the bank will probably won't give me more money. So what do you do?
Well, and you all know that the first ratings have their place, but it is a flawed system. It's flawed in a couple of places. One size doesn't fit all. It's just hard to take a criteria and apply it to every school district out there when you've got so many of us out in the hinterlands, outside the major metro areas that may be losing students. And then you've got some fast growth areas, obviously Houston, the west side, the Austin, San Antonio corridor, DFW, all around Dallas County. They're just exploding. Look at what's that? North of Dallas, Allen, west of Allen, Frisco. 15 years ago, Frisco was one subdivision with a little golf course and a gas station with a convenience fast food restaurant in it and one stoplight. Literally a one stoplight town 15, 16 years ago. And Frisco has a bond election next month for what, $775 million? A few more than one stoplights in that town now. Big place and growing too fast for their own good. First, you could develop a good first rating for their debt. It's not going to work over here in Deer Park or LaPorte, where they're built out and not their student growth isn't, their student body isn't growing very much. They're two completely different places. First, also, rewards you for having low expenditures per student, but the legislature has passed, well, 5 salary increases in the last 20 years for teachers, so we want to pay them more, but then first penalizes us for paying more. Not sure I quite get that. There's lots of things I don't know. I don't understand the first ratings, the whole purpose. I don't understand how boats float and planes fly. Do you understand the boat thing, Chris?
Oh, yes, I understand the boat.
You got the boat thing? All right. That's all right. Explain it to me when you take a breath. This is one I'm interested to hear the ratings folks talk about today, if they do address this. What I heard 5 years ago is getting the awards for your budget, getting the GFOA and ASBO awards for your comprehensive annual financial report is looked upon favorably. In some states, that probably is a very good thing to have. In Texas, with the very standardized format of our financial and compliance report, most of the information that they want is going to be in that report. The information that is in the statistical section of the comprehensive annual financial report, they pretty much already got all that from MAC anyway. So I'm interested to see what they have to say about this. Obviously, compliance with GASB standards. You probably chuckle at that a little bit because you're thinking, of course we comply with GASB standards. That's setting the bar pretty low to have that in the top 10 list. This is more of a problem in other states than it is here in Texas. Documenting the practices that you have in writing and communicating them during the ratings process and in between rating processes. If you're a fast growth district and you are selling bonds every year or every 2 years, obviously you're going to get very familiar with the people who are rating you periodically when you have those conferences with them, whether you go to them or you do it on the phone or they come to you. Sending some of this information into them in between the formal ratings processes. Probably not a bad idea. That wake you up, put you to sleep. Questions? There's many people with questions. You don't have a question? You always pepper me with questions, Kurt.
Maybe on the back to that, it's not necessarily a requirement, but you're talking about here, when you talk about 65% and such. This is for better range. Ideally, you'd like to see
Yes.
this happen. Ideally, I'd like to get it to done faster. 5-inch vertical lead. So this, can you speak a little bit about that? That's the ideal.
Well,
you get as close to that as you can.
I think to expound on the rapid debt retirement, in theory, globally, sure, you want to pay off your debt as soon as you can. Maybe more importantly, from a financial standpoint, would be to match the useful life of the assets to the debt. If you were selling $50 million in bonds and it's all for technology infrastructure, I hope for your sake and the taxpayer's sake, you're going to pay all that off within 10 years because that's about how long it's going to last before you're going to have to replace it. If it's for school buses, you'll probably amortize that over 10 or 12 years, knowing those buses may last if you take good care of them 20 years. So you probably can get away with a 20-year repayment. Buildings, if you're building a brand new building, well, most of our buildings down here are going to last 40 years. I think the average age of a Deer Park building is, Pete, even with the new elementary, 38, 42 years or so. Typically, you're going to amortize that debt over a shorter period of time. But if you've got a hodgepodge of things that you're paying for with the bond money, I think if you match if you've got buses, if you've got technology infrastructure, if you've got renovations of existing facilities, if you are matching your debt to the estimated useful life of those assets, you will naturally front load your debt schedule. Now, where that gets out of sort sometimes is you look at your existing debt schedule and you're already front loaded. You have to shift some of that back to smooth out the tax burden. That's when you're not going to be that 65%.
I think some people get into a situation by what I'll call artificially keeping that tax burden low, like extending out debt, extending things out. And when you do that, that makes the next bond election, you do this that much further back, start with long-term debt, look at that. You're going to see how much interest you're paying extra percentage.
And there's going to be issues depending on what your existing debt is and what your needs are. There's going to be issues that are going to conflict with your ability to do that. In a perfect world, if you have no debt, you've got high values per student, 65%, piece of cake. Knock that out easy. If you've been growing and you've got a debt structure out there in existence, unless the market conditions are really favorable, you can't just go out and refinance it, restructure that whole thing to comply with 65%. So it's a nice target to aim for. It may not be something that you can go from being at 50% and in your next sale jump that up to 65%. You may have to make incremental progress. You may even have to go backward before you can go forward on that. Nothing else? Okay, well, thank you.
We were able to get our meeting iPads going, so if you have, of course, a copy of the handout, but if you'd like to see it electronically, you can check out one of our mini iPads and use during our meeting, and then you can turn it back in whenever you finish. More or less, you have your own iPad. They're all right there in the little mid-section. So, and on there, you already have the app ready. All you do is click on that, and you have the information there. So hopefully next month we won't be printing copies anymore. It will just be all electronic. Now you're welcome to bring your own device, but we'll have about roughly 25 or so available every meeting. So when you come in, pick one up and use it during the time, and then turn it back in whenever before you leave. So you will have it available electronically, and we won't kill any more trees. So we'll be a green. All right. Continuing, I think our next presenter is here already. Let's see, where are we? Oh. We made a change, and that's the Ola Kushima. Yes. All right. She's with Moody's Service, so welcome. And she'll be the first rating agency talking to you regarding rating issues and changes in bond interest. Please help me welcome Ms. Iwola Kushima.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? So my name is Boba Kashimo. I'm an analyst at Moody's Investor Service. I'm sure that we've had the pleasure of working with some of the individuals in this room. But just real quickly, by show of hands, how many people are familiar with the rating process? Oh, okay. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the rating process, what we do, and also kind of talk about our new general obligation methodology. It's definitely a hot topic for a lot of our issuers right now because it does incorporate pensions, which, as you know, I think it was Warren Buffett that called pensions the tapeworm. So there's a lot of conversation about pensions, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'll also talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we're looking at and some of the things that we're paying attention to going into the rest of this year. getting started, ratings, for those of you that are not very familiar with the process, but ratings are essentially just an objective assessment of relative credit worthiness. Relative because we do take into consideration how a school district in North Houston compares to a school district in Chicago, for example. So we do a lot of comparisons between similarly rated entities, maybe entities that are right next to you, as well as entities that are across the nation. And then something else that I'd like to highlight as well is our ratings are forward-looking, even though we take into consideration information from previous audits and information that you tell us about what's going on with the current economy in your area. We also do, our ratings do speak to your future ability to be able to pay debt and to be able to service bondholders, your obligation to bondholders. There's some misconceptions about what ratings are and what they're not, but it's definitely not a report card. We know that some individuals treat them that way, maybe in speaking to the board. It's not a report card, it's just an assessment of credit, really. And also, ratings are not fixed. So for example, if you do come into Moody's today and you get a rating of X, in a couple of years, that rating may be upgraded or downgraded, just depending on what the current environment is and what we know about your credit at that particular time. Okay, so I always like pop quizzes. This is always fun. But just real quickly, this is our rating scale. All the way at the top is the AAA. It's the lowest risk, of course, and then you can kind of get down into speculative grades or non-investment grade, and it goes all the way to C. But by show of hands, or if anybody wants to take a guess, what is Houston ISD rated? Guesses? Houston ISD? Yes. Okay, Houston ISD is actually a AAA. AAA. Let's see. What about North Forest ISD before the annexation? Does everybody remember North Forest? Yes? Okay, so what's the guess there? What are we thinking? That's actually right. It wasn't a BA category. So, and then of course, once it got annexed by Houston ISD, the ratings, the debt, all of that gets incorporated into Houston ISD's balance sheet. So right now, those bonds are rated AAA. But for most school districts, you can see that the national distribution, it's kind of like a bell curve. Most of the school districts kind of fall in the AA2 to A1, A2 range. That's not uncommon. School districts tend to face different challenges than cities, for example. And then of course, in Texas, if you look at the distribution, I think it's skewed a little bit. It's probably somewhere around the AA1 to AA3, because Texas school districts do tend to be stronger than a lot of school districts that we see in the nation. Any questions thus far? Is there a reason that Texas is stronger? So typically we find that Texas school districts tend to have a lot of money. Cash is always a good thing. We also find that Texas school districts, because of the funding levels and the way the pension system is funded, their pension numbers look relatively good compared to a lot of other school districts. And then typically, school districts in Texas do have an ability to break teacher contracts, for example. So it wasn't uncommon during the previous biennium to see school districts do some reduction in forces. Essentially, they have a lot more control over their expenditures, and a lot of school districts don't really have, across the nation, a lot of school districts don't really have those opportunities. Any other questions? Okay, so the rating process. Typically what happens is we get a call from a financial advisor like Dwayne that's over there, or sometimes directly from the issuer, and they're asking us for a rating. Now what we do is, over the course of maybe a week or a couple of weeks, we do want to talk to you and see, we want you to tell us things that the audit is not going to tell us. So of course, we've taken a look at your numbers, we know what the audit is saying, If you've had a recently passed bond election, we know information about that, the approval process or the approval rates, but we want you to tell us things that we wouldn't know from the numbers. So what's going on in your economy? Do you have a new business coming into the area? Do you have a business that's leaving the area? How are your top 10 taxpayers doing? How are your top employers doing? We want to know all that information. Additionally, if there's information about maybe some things that the board is deciding with money and expenditures, we definitely want to know that. We just really want you to paint a picture of things that we wouldn't know just by looking at the numbers. We want you to tell us what's driving the numbers. So over the course of the process, you talk to a Moody's analyst, they get all the information from you, and then they will put together the information and make a presentation to the rating committee. Rating committee is made up of senior analysts at Moody's, and typically if there's something specialized to your district, we will try to get expertise from individuals across the company that know about that industry. So for example, I cover the San Antonio area, and I cover a lot of school districts in that area. The military and what's going on with the federal government is always a hot topic. I know a little bit about it, but of course we have analysts, we have the sovereign analyst that covers the US government rating, and we also have the state analysts, both of them are in New York, that cover the state of Texas rating. So those individuals will typically pull on them for their expertise in the conversation. So the analyst will make a rating presentation to committee. The rating is determined by majority vote in committee. And once that's done, the analyst would have a draft report. They type up a draft report and send that to you so you know exactly what the rating is. You also have an opportunity to take a look at the report and see if there's inaccurate information. We definitely want to know about that, as well as if there's confidential information that shouldn't be in the marketplace. We want to know about that. And once you've had an opportunity to do that, the report gets released to the marketplace and everyone knows the information and it's public at that time. So that's the process, but how do we actually get to the rating? What we do is we look at 4 factors primarily. Recently, a couple of months ago, Moody's did update its general obligation bond methodology. And the reason we did that is we wanted to reflect some of the recent trends in the industry and some of the key things or the key issues, including pensions. We talked a little bit about that, but that's definitely, it's something that we've always taken into consideration, but we wanted to be sure that it was included in our methodology. Additionally, we created a scorecard. The scorecard is to enhance the transparency of the process. And in one of the following slides, I'll show you exactly how the scorecard is broken out and how the different factors are taken into consideration. I think the key thing to keep in mind is the scorecard is not an exhaustive list. So there may be things specific to your district that the scorecard doesn't do a good job of capturing. And the analyst, the lead analyst, does have an opportunity to make notching adjustments for that. So say, for instance, in fiscal 2014, the school district is looking at a $7 million surplus on a budget that's $100 million. That's almost 10%. That will definitely not reflect in the scorecard, but your analyst can make an adjustment to say, okay, something positive is coming down in a few months. And of course, the final rating is determined by a rating committee. Okay, so this is what the old scorecard was at the bottom. Economy used to be 40%, finances 30%, management 20%, and then the last 10% was debt. Now what we did was we essentially took 10% away from the economy and moved that over to the debt section, and that really accounts for pensions. I think this probably gives you a better picture of what the ratings are. So, we talk about when you're dealing with your lead analyst, you definitely want to paint a picture of what's going on in your economy, how strong it is, how robust it is, how diverse it is. The lead analyst definitely wants to know that. Those are some of the factors or the metrics that we used in evaluating the Also finances, what we've done now is kind of take a look at operating fund balance. For school districts, typically that means your general fund and your debt service fund. So when you think about the calculations that we use, for example, fund balance as a percentage of operating revenues, that is operating fund balance, which would be debt service and general fund. Management, one of the things that we did is we created the institutional framework. I can't talk this morning. And that just really speaks to your legal ability as an issuer or as a school district to match your expenditures and your revenues. So Texas school districts, going back to the question from earlier on, Texas school districts are rated, I think it's an A, which is a lot higher than what we would typically see for a lot of school districts. Most of the school districts, or all the school districts I cover in Oklahoma, are rated B, BAA for that category, because they don't really have a lot of flexibility to conduct their business. And then we also take a look at operating history. We do a 5-year average so that we can smoothen out any highs and lows. And really, the big deal is the pensions. Of course, school districts in Texas do contribute to the Texas retirement system. And so what we did was, based on the school district's contribution into the system, we did a calculation and backed into those numbers. And just based on that contribution, we took a look at the liability for all Texas issuers or for all Texas school districts and got a calculation just based on your contribution to figure out what your approximate liability is. So we took it a step further. Typically, a lot of pension systems, their investment rate of return could be somewhere around 7%. Sometimes we see 8%. That's a little generous from our perspective. And so the discount rate, the investment rate of return that we use is a little bit more conservative. It's published, I think, in 2012, I want to say it was 4.5%. So for example, what you get from TRS as your liability, if it's allocated, will probably be much smaller than what Moody's shows as your liability, just because of the calculation that we do. Yes, sir.
So for let me make sure I understand this. For comparability purposes, you're allocating TRS system liability to us, but with the understanding that it's not actually the school district's liability.
That is correct, yes. Now, the caveat or one of the things that we are watching going forward, some states have started doing pension reform. And what that means for some of their participants is they're pushing a lot more liability to the participants. Texas hasn't mentioned anything about that, but it's something that we're always constantly thinking about. If Texas decides that school districts need to pick up a little bit more, then of course the allocation and the calculations that we do will take that into consideration if they decide to go in that direction. Other questions? No? Okay. All right, and again, just as a reminder, everywhere there's operating revenues in here, typically that will be general fund and debt service fund. Yeah. Okay, so I had mentioned a few minutes ago that sometimes the scorecard doesn't really take into consideration other events or data sets or just things that are not captured quantitatively. So what we do is once the scorecard gives a rating, we will make any additional notching. So if it needs to be notched down because we know that the general fund is going to be eroded in this fiscal year, we will take that into consideration, probably in the credit event trend, not yet reflected in the existing data set. If there are some positives, we'll take that into consideration. So if you happen to be a school district that is benefiting from, maybe a huge university, or maybe you have huge military concentration, or just institutional presence in general, we do take that into consideration. If there are unusually strong management practices, so for example, if the school district has a policy of, I don't know, maybe 50% in general fund reserves, and if the district dips into reserves, then they have a plan that's already codified on how to refund or replenish the reserves. We do take things like that into consideration. And the analyst will make appropriate notching. And committee, of course, would have to agree or disagree on the notching factors. Questions? Okay. I thought it would be beneficial to kind of provide the national medians for school districts, just some general information. Debt, of course, now that's 20%. So we'll just looking at the direct debt, as a percentage of full value. As we get closer to the AAA, debt tends to be lower. And I think that's just fundamentally, if you have a lot of debt, you're taking on a lot more risk. So we tend to see the debt levels a little bit lower as you get closer to the AAA. Having said that, we do have school districts in Texas that have quite a bit of debt, but we understand that Texas, for example, is growing. There is population growth. That means that you have a lot of students, and that means that a lot of school districts are building facilities to accommodate these students. So that's taken into consideration. And then if you're looking at the general fund levels, they tend to be relatively healthy in Texas. As you go down the rating scale, and definitely once you get into the investment grade category, those numbers tend to be weaker and weaker. And I think once you start to get into the BAA3s and BA1s, typically we find that those are storied credits. So Fremont ISD, for example, has some accreditation as well as financial challenges. It's currently rated BA1 because of that. North Forest, like I mentioned, was rated BA1 before the annexation into Houston ISD. And the story kind of goes on, but it's all similar once you get into the lower end of the rating scale. And then just some other information that I think is helpful. We tend to find that full value, of course, tends to be higher as you move up. And then wealth levels tend to be a little bit higher as you move up as well. Any questions?
What are some of the things that significantly would allow a district to move from one to another?
Okay, so one of the things that Moody's is big on is trends, right? So say for instance you have a year where you have a significant increase in your general fund. Well, that's great, but if you're going to go into the next year completely erode the surplus, then that doesn't really mean anything. So we're looking for a strong positive trend. So positive trends in your full value, because we know that that's what the district is tapping to repay debt service. We're looking for strong trends in your general fund and your financial performance. And we're also looking for a pretty strong, stable management team. I think for us, it's more about, we want to know that you're sophisticated about your business. So regardless of the rating level, we just want to, when we talk to you, we want to get a sense that you know exactly what you're doing, you know how to conduct your business. Even if you're having, if you have a change, like if one of the key or upper, more senior level individuals left, we still want to know that the district itself is able to continue functioning and remain viable. So it's not necessarily a one-man shop. The district itself is just going to be healthy. So strong trends in the right direction. Okay, I wanted to close and just kind of reiterate some of the things that we're paying attention to as we go forward. Pensions. Right now, Texas school districts are in a really good place because of the way the pension system has been funded, especially when we look at some of the other systems across the country. Just as an FYI, the median local government issuer, their pension as a percentage of operating revenues, which again is general fund and debt service fund, is 1 times. So if you look at that number, that adjusted liability divided by operating revenues, it's 1 times on average. a lot of our Texas issuers are well under 1 times. Even for school districts that are pretty sizable, I mean, the liability is definitely manageable. We do have some school districts that are maybe closer to 1, but I don't think I've seen any school districts that's over 1. And I know that when we did the pension update, we did put some school districts and some issuers on review because of their pension challenges, and some ratings did change because of the pension challenges. So pension is definitely a hot topic. The lawsuit regarding funding for school districts is something that we're watching as well to see what the state is going to decide, if they're going to change the Robin Hood system, and what that means for issuers. Last biennium, we did see the state reduce funding for school districts because of budgetary pressures. That's something else that we're watching going forward. Right now, the indication is that Texas is in a good place. You know, our numbers are looking strong from the state level, but nobody ever really knows. So that's something that we continue to pay attention to. And I think that's about it, just in terms of what we're thinking about at this current time.
During the TRS, also managing the TRS care, there's been a lot of discussion about how that's going to impact and some rate increases. How have you guys seen that impact into the fund?
So what we've seen is a lot of increases in healthcare, both for those that are in the TRS system, as well as individuals or districts that are self-funded. We're seeing an increase in healthcare costs. It's a challenge for a lot of issuers, frankly. But we haven't. A lot of school districts a lot of them are absorbing the costs and not passing it on to employees. And from our perspective, we just want to know that if you're absorbing it, then it's something that's built into the budget in terms of how are your revenues going to match up to that. If it's something that the district can easily absorb, then it's not so much a challenge. But if it becomes a pressure on the expenditure side and it's starting to disrupt the fiscal health of the district, then you may see a year where, I don't know, there could be maybe like an outlook placed on the ratings, and if it's pretty severe, then I think you'd probably see rating movement.
Do you have the outlook part? What are some of the descriptors that you use?
So we have we essentially have three outlooks. We have a positive outlook, a negative outlook, and a stable outlook. And a lot of times you find that when you read a rating report, there's no outlook on it. I think that effectively means it's stable. But really what we use outlooks to address is over the next 18 to 24 months, we think that the high probability, for example, if it's negative, that this rating would be coming down, except if X, Y, Z, and W happens. And it's the same thing for the positive outlook as well. Over the next 18 to 24 months, we do believe that this rating is moving up. And stable is just, it's stable. We think it's going to be stable. Any other questions? Yes.
You're looking more favorable than Texas debt situation and pension situation, and you're changing your ratings to where that's going to be 20% now. That means possible upgrades to children.
For some issuers, it's making enough of a difference that it does move them into the next rating category, just looking at the numbers. But for a lot of our issuers, when we did the methodology update, the rating distribution really did look like a bell curve. So a lot of the issuers were right there in the middle, so much so that the rating methodology, the update wasn't making a difference. And then you have the outliers that it did make a difference for on both sides. If that is the case, you will get a call from one of our analysts and they'll want to talk to you and tell you this is exactly why we're reaching out to you, because this is what we're seeing in our numbers, and we just want to have a better understanding of it. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
feel is important in assessing the credit of the issuer. And through a comprehensive rating process, they will prepare a presentation, and of course the committee will determine the final rating level. Every committee is made up of at least 5 analysts, including, it includes senior analysts, it includes independent from other groups, because we want to make sure that we provide an overall comprehensive understanding of the rating and setting it. After the committee has determined the final rating, it's distributed through press release and on our website. And one of the things that helps keep the ratings fresh and appropriate is what we call the surveillance cycle. After an initial rating, we make sure that we continue to assess the appropriateness of the rating level. And there's a very similar process to that initial rating to do surveillance ratings. And Fitch will contact the issuer when that cycle is up. To determine how long that will be, we have several factors. Most GO ratings tend to fall into the higher categories of AAA, AA, or A. And if the outlook is stable for that rating, the rating cycle will be 2 years. So after an initial rating, 2 years later, if there's not been any additional debt issued, Fitch will come to you and approach you about the surveillance rating. Now, we also have rating outlooks, as you know of, and those can be positive, negative, or much more rare, evolving. And what these do is they signal the direction of the rating. They say that there's at least a 50% or greater chance that the rating will be changing within the next 1 to 2 years. And obviously negative is down, positive is up. Evolving means that there's more information that needs to be determined. Those are rare. We also have what's called a rating watch. And these are event driven. They say that given the occurrence of an event, the rating is probable to change, either negative or positive. And those are reviewed every 6 months because of the nature of the event-driven rating. So, as you've seen before, there are 4 factors which are evaluated in determining the appropriate rating level: debt, local economy, financial operations, and management and administration. And Fitch recognizes that these are all interactive factors. You may have a situation where a local economy is rather weak, but strong financial management and low debt has a tendency to offset that. And so that speaks to the issuer's response to a situation that may be out of their control, and that's certainly a credit positive. And so you probably have received a handout, I hope, outlining our tax-supported rating criteria, and that will go into more information on each one of these. And additionally, we'll explain these in more detail. But of course, the rating does apply to the security itself. And so one of the important assessments is the strength of the pledge for payment to bondholders. So here are some of the criteria we use in determining the strength of the pledge. As you know, unlimited tax general obligation bonds do have the strongest pledge because the borrower can raise taxes to meet the needs. Limited tax would be what's considered mid-range. And if you have revenue bonds, it's diversity of the revenue stream that essentially determines the strength of that pledge. So, getting into those 4 factors, the first one that we'll discuss is the debt and the long-term liabilities of the issuer. So these are the elements that we consider in assessing the debt. Ones that you've heard of, obviously, are the overall debt level, the overall burden of debt on the issuer and the taxpayers. As well, we want to see We want to know what are your plans? When will you be seeking additional authorization? What are your capital plans? And as you've heard, our capital plans, what's the mix between payment through bonds and pay-as-you-go or financing from reserves? And that mix is an important consideration in determining the overall strength of this factor. Litigation, contingent liabilities obviously can influence things. You know, pension and OPEB are big concerns these days. They're not included in the issuer's direct debt ratios because they are somewhat more variable. But they constitute a future obligation. So it is very important that we consider the magnitude of the unfunded liability. The ratio, as you've heard, can be adjusted based on several factors. The discount rate that's used, the investment assumptions, the benefits that are received. And so what we do is we do adjust the discount rates that are used to 7% in order to achieve comparability among credits. And it's viewed as somewhat more conservative than some. Credit positives are going to be well-funded pension plans, consistently funded pension plans. What is the annual required contribution? How much of that is paid every year? And then if it's not well-funded, what are the plans to reduce it? Does the issuer have flexibility to change entitlements, to bring that up to a higher level? Red flags are things that might give rise to concerns in a rating committee. As you know, these are some of the factors that may weaken the debt position of the district, especially high variable rate debt, swap obligations. As we mentioned before, that pension funding ratio is an important consideration. And what are our future plans for addressing that liability if it exists? I know this is small. It's sort of an aggregation of everything that I've mentioned up to this point in terms of debt. At the top, you see the descriptions that are stronger and how we kind of assess each one of those factors. And it is a mix of all of these things that are discussed before in determining the overall debt attribute.
And I would just like to mention that for each of those attributes that we talked about in the tax-supported rating criteria, you will see that there's those three breakouts of strong, mid-range, weaker for each of those elements. So you can kind of see each element, debt, finance, socioeconomic profile, management, all can be broken out further. And this is something that we look at as part of, where does this school district, for example, stand in relation to how strong or weak together those elements come together and interact to provide a rating. So I just want to indicate that the structure is the same on all those elements that the changes mentioned.
Right, and you'll see in this table, we do have concrete numbers. What are the overall debt levels per capita, and in comparison with market value, what is the rate of amortization? What is the pension liability, and it can help us group that into the appropriate category. And with this, I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
So now we'll touch on the element of local economy and tax base. And, looking at this section, certainly, we can recognize that there's some natural constraints to perhaps the school district's profile. I think earlier it was mentioned there's a large refinery in your district. It's predominantly residential. There are things that make up a district. It is what it is. But that said, we do take a look at that. We take a look across school districts across the country. So how is yours similar, different, than others? So that it provides context on, again, the quality of life, but in those sense of interactive factors, how does the issuer's economy, how does that base support balanced operations and debt repayment? What are the potential future financial challenges? So of course, we might look at that in the sense of, we just talked about debt. How does a debt structure play into where this locality is going? Are they, kind of moving along slowly? Nothing much is happening. Is this a growing place? Does a rising debt service schedule really make sense with what's happening in the economic profile? So, we look at these things. Also, in regards to the socioeconomic status of the population repaying the debt, the employment trends. Is this a school district outside a large metro area, easily commutable, things like that? We take a look at all these things and how that blends in taking a look at the picture of how this combines with debt and the finances and management and such. And I did want to mention, kind of going back to that, here's those elements again. One of the things we do look at is I think Bola mentioned earlier, we look at trends as well. And trends, certainly, something we've been looking at, it's been kind of an interesting picture, is how have folks been doing since, over and through the recession. And so it's an interesting picture just to see even like, there's been some school districts right there in the Dallas metro area, and you would think, oh my gosh, they're all growing, they did okay through the recession, and some had more sluggish performance in their tax base than you might have thought. Others, steadily moved along, had growth every year. Others took a bit of a hit one year and came out strong the next. So it's a variety of pictures that you see, but it is evocative and reflective of what is happening there and what that means for, again, the district's financial situation and what they have to do with their tax rate to pay their debt, and what's happening there in their economy and tax base locally. Financial operations, of course, are where you are keenly involved. I did want to get a show of hands. Who here has been part of a bond rating call? I don't care from whom. and anybody is yet to do so, right around the corner and hasn't been yet. Okay, got a couple hands there. Okay, so financial operations is certainly where we kind of get to the meat of it. And, in the credit analysis, some of the things that you would expect, structurally balanced operations. I've had a number of school districts, I think most everybody in Texas school district land felt the pain of the last biennium and what that meant. Yet still, there were a variety of responses across the board. Recently, I spoke to a district who's rather troubled at the moment, and their story was that, the drawdowns were because, we got cut in the last biennium. Well, lots of districts have had a lot of different solutions to that problem of what they had to do to be either maintain structurally balanced operations, perhaps take a one-time hit and right size. Those things have varied, but it is intriguing to see again. And I believe Bola mentioned also how some districts, we do look at that flexibility, and that's becoming more and more key, is what kind of revenue or expenditure flexibility do you have? And school districts, have some, we talked about Texas is a right to work state, the contracts are able to be adjusted 1 to 2 to 3 years in most cases. And so there's not like big labor issues as there are in other states necessarily. But with that said, school districts are still everything is deemed, as it is by the state. It's a captive, shall we say, organization to some extent. And then there you are. You can't levy, 129 on your M&O rate. You've got it no more than 117, of course. So we look at these variety of issues. We spoke about contingency planning, prudent reserves. Certainly, I think there was a comment about are reserves too high, too low. We do want to see that flexibility, and as defined through what that flexibility might be. Is 2 months, 3 months of operating expenditure what y'all think as your institution, your board feel is appropriate? Obviously, y'all have to answer to your taxpayers as well, who might feel that a 50% fund balance is too high, that's not appropriate. There's a middle ground, no doubt. But we also look at, again, what has been decided upon, what has been formally planned. Is this, again, a one-man operation, or has this been more, again, decided across the board in conjunction with your board, with management across the way, or has there been difficulty in getting consensus? Revenue and spending limitations, we're probably all familiar with that, but to the extent that, we're looking at not only establishing a policy, but adhering to that, whether it's formally or an informal policy for your district. Certainly, the inability to raise revenue or fund programs due to political or other practical considerations becomes a question we're going to want to explore more. Not to get into the history of the district since 1929, but to understand what has happened that, let's say, your voters have turned down a tax ratification election for 13 cents, or they have approved a bond election, and at how high a percentage, because the strength of that approval gives us some comfort to know that your citizens are ready to take the debt on because they've approved it at a pretty strong level, whether it's that ratification election or the bond election. And if that's passed or failed, if it's been attempted, if you're going to go out again, what that means. If somebody's at 117 right now and they're not making their budget work, that's going to be a problem until something gets settled further with the school finance legislature lawsuit. And I would add here too that certainly, one of the overarching, things we do indicate is that, we're looking at Texas school districts in the regulatory environment, in the framework that they exist. And so all of these pieces, the 50 cents test, right? The 50-cent test that has to be passed at the Attorney General's office for new debt has not changed in many years, and we see more and more districts bumping up against that as some of these fast growth districts have had to take on additional debt to build their facilities. So we ask these type of questions and look at these constraints that are both internal and external to the regulatory framework, the state's framework, and even internally in your district and political environment. Red flags, certainly, I think we're probably all familiar with a number of these, we do look keenly at interfund transfers that could be used to mask weakened fund balances, mismatch between revenue and spending growth, what's going on with budget to actual when things don't perform. Perhaps estimates are too aggressive, perhaps. There have been cases, of course, of school districts overestimating enrollment. It doesn't pan out, and they need to pay back, and somehow they forgot about that the next year, and it gets a lot tighter. No what-if scenarios, and again, it's a rare, I can't think of a Texas school district offhand that has had to negotiate short-term borrowing for the most part.